Please welcome Andrew Slaughter, Executive Director, Deloitte Center for Energy Solutions, Deloitte Services, LP.
Good morning, everybody. If we can take our seats for the next session. Thank you for your attendance. It's a wonderful turnout today. I'm very pleased that on this agenda where we're talking about innovation and technology in the energy space, I'm really pleased that we found a space to talk about innovation in oil and gas. Some of the speakers this morning have mentioned the importance of that in making gas supplies available at a moderate cost, and I think it really transcends just the oil and gas space. It is an area where Deloitte does do its own work. I'll draw your attention to our work on the Internet of Things in oil and gas and on patent trends in oil and gas. I think it's a fascinating area, and it's something we're going to follow again and again. So it's really a great pleasure this morning to introduce a talk about the innovation process, particularly focusing on unconventional oil and gas. And we're really fortunate to have Robert Kleinberg with us today. He is one of our leading experts nationally in unconventional oil and gas. He has spent his career with Schlumberger. He is a Schlumberger Fellow, one of the elite group of technology experts that go out and talk about research, technology, and innovation. So we're really fortunate. Bob is not only an expert, he's also a practitioner. He has over 30 patents pending in the field. He has designed and invented geophysical equipment which has been deployed across the space. And he spends a lot of his time now working with government, working with academic institutions to shape and drive the oil and gas research agenda as we go forward. It's a very rich field. And today he's going to talk about how the innovation process works and how it fits with the volatile cycles that we all know the industry goes through. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Robert Kleinberg of Schlumberger.
Well, thank you, Andrew. It's a real pleasure to be here speaking to the Deloitte Energy Conference, and an honor. And I'm really delighted to be here. I'm talking today about the relationship between business cycles and innovation cycles, and do they relate? And in some fields, in software and consumer electronics, we have an innovation cycle of 18 months or something. Oil and gas is different, and I'm going to sort of emphasize those differences today. Now, only I think a minority of the audience is sort of involved in oil and gas upstream, but you might just think about sort of the lessons that I'm giving and see how they apply to your particular situations. So first, just a word about Schlumberger for those of you who are not familiar. We are the people that are the actual providers of exploration, drilling, and stimulation production services to the oil and gas industry. On the left is a picture of me at a well site in the Eagle Ford Shale Formation in South Texas. The right is a photograph I took at one of our hydraulic fracturing jobs in Greene County, Pennsylvania. That's all Schlumberger equipment, all Schlumberger personnel. So we are the people that do the fracking. So if there are any environmentalists here, you can sort of throw a tomato at me. No, good. Okay. I do want to say that the views expressed here are my own, do not necessarily represent those of Schlumberger management. However, I think you'll find them very well aligned. So first, the question, what do we actually mean by innovation? And these days you find in the petroleum literature a lot of statements like this, which came out in the Oil and Gas Journal a couple of months ago. U.S. shale resilience, a product of innovation, CEOs say. So what do they mean by innovation? Well, a lot of it if you read deeper into these articles, what you find, a lot of it is process and efficiency improvements. And to take nothing away from the innovative effort and the hard work that goes into this, these things are somewhat routine in the industry. So what you find is that costs increase during the early phase of the cycle and decrease during later phases of the cycle. Now, what I've done is I've sort of coded these changes according to sort of a sunrise color, so that's early development cycle in yellow, and then the sunset color in sort of blue or twilight color is what you find late in the development cycle. And pretty uniformly, except for taxes, which are somewhat different, you find that costs increase early and decrease late as a play is developed. So for example, at the beginning, when you're first developing a field, you have a lot of drilling and stimulation surprises because the drillers are not familiar with the geology, and a lot of things can go wrong when you're drilling blindly miles into the earth. Later on, the drillers are used to the local geology and drilling becomes much more efficient. Similarly, early in the phase, there's competition for leases and the price of leases gets driven up. Later in the phase, leases are consolidated, which is an efficiency improvement. Early in the phase, early in the cycle, you have bottlenecks in supply chain and infrastructure. Later on, those supply chains get optimized and the infrastructure gets built out. And then from our side, on the service company side, early on we have equipment and personnel shortages in localities. Late in the cycle, our competition has come in, unfortunately. We need to become more efficient, and basically our customers extract discounts from us at that point. So these are natural parts of the progression. And I think this is illustrated very well from some data from the Energy Information Administration, which we rely on very heavily, and thank you to Administrator Szyminski for the marvelous job he's doing. On the left is a chart where time is on the horizontal axis over the last 10 years or so from 2006. The vertical axis is the average cost to drill and complete a well in millions of dollars. So, for example, back in 2006, wells cost $5.5–6.5 million to drill. The various lines correspond to the various shale plays. Now, some of these are tight oil, like Bakken, Eagle Ford, and Permian, names which are probably familiar to many of you who read the newspaper. The green is the Marcellus, which is the big gas play in Pennsylvania and Ohio and West Virginia. And what we see very uniformly throughout the cycle is that costs start to increase, in fact, by 40 to 50% from trough to peak. And then around 2012, costs started decreasing because we're in the more mature phase where these reservoirs have been delineated, where the drillers know how to drill, where the supply chains have been optimized, and prices have fallen 25 to 30%. So these are really big changes, and this is what I call everyday innovations that continue through business cycles and are largely immune to them because nothing particularly happened in the markets in 2012. We had the big price fall off in the middle of 2014 after a lot of these savings had already been realized. So let's continue to ask that question. What do we mean by innovation? Well, again, if you read sort of down in those articles where they talk about innovation, a lot of it boils down to what is known in the trade as superfracs. And so these are basically hydraulic fracturing, but sort of more so. So longer horizontal wells, or what we call laterals. More fracturing in each horizontal well, tighter fraction initiation points. More water per foot of well, and more sand per foot of well. So these superfracs have really materially improved the productivity of wells, but by a means that I would call, to be honest, more brute force, rather than like exceptionally high-level scientific thinking. And that's okay, that's innovative, but again, it's an evolutionary improvement. Similarly, what we've seen in the last year and a half or so, since oil prices have sort of fallen off a cliff, is the high grading of assets. So when you retire 75% of your drilling fleet, a lot of things happen. For one thing, you no longer do any drilling in areas where you are not very familiar with the geology. So that means no more de-risking of assets. So all that exploratory drilling, forget it, it's gone. That's what happens when you reduce your rig fleet by 75%. We had a large inventory of what are called drilled and uncompleted wells. What that means is that sometimes you are more or less compelled to drill a well because you either are under contractual obligation to a service provider that you've already paid for, or to maintain a lease. Leases often require you to continue drilling wells. However, you're not required to complete them. So this means you can put a hole in the ground, case it, and so it's all safe, but you don't bother doing the hydraulic fracture stimulation step, which triggers the beginning of production. So you've got this inventory. It actually came to thousands of wells across the United States, of wells that were sort of sitting there waiting to be completed and to put on production. Now that inventory is starting to be drawn down. And so that's a low-cost sort of situation. It only costs another $1 million to complete the well. So that's part of this asset high grading business. You're spending less to produce more. When you cut your fleet by 75%, only the best rigs and crews survive. Only the most productive ones, only the most up-to-date on automated rigs. So we've seen that. And finally, what I call ultra sweet spotting. This is sort of a technical industry term. What it means is only drilling where you know you've got the very best resource. So all that has been going on to reduce costs, increase productivity, and that's also part of innovation, sort of more in an evolutionary fashion. I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about large-scale innovation, industry-changing innovation, and how that develops over business cycles. These are where you really need to develop technology. I'm a technology developer, so I'm very interested in this process. And when Andrew and I first started talking about this topic, I went back and I have kind of a fund of my own information and my own projects, and I know how they've gone, but I really wanted to look carefully on a broader range of topics to see how they developed during business cycles. And I came in with some expectations which, frankly, were not satisfied. So this was real research where I learned something. I did a number of case studies. I'm only going to present a few today in interest of time. But the things that really have been industry changing were 3D seismic, prospecting, logging while drilling and geosteering, rotary steerable drilling, horizontal drilling and massive hydraulic fracturing for shale, and a tight oil recovery is something that is still in process. So first, let's look at logging while drilling and geosteering. This is going to be pretty kind of in the weeds for those of you in the electric power sector, but it is a fascinating process. So what I have here is a graph. The horizontal axis is what we call measured depth, which is the amount of drill pipe in the ground. So that's the total length of the well, both horizontal and vertical. The vertical axis is true vertical depth, how deep you are in the earth. And we measure those things independently. So on the horizontal axis, it goes from 8,000 to 16,000 feet. So what's happened is that the well has been drilled vertically for 8,000 feet, 1.5 miles. That's very typical practice today in North American shale. Then kicked off horizontally for another 8,000 feet, also typical practice. Now, one thing I'd like to emphasize about this graph is that the scale division on the horizontal axis is 1,000 feet per division. On the vertical axis, 25 feet per division. So there's a 40x vertical exaggeration. So keep that in mind. So basically, there's two ways to drill a horizontal well. Either you go down 8,000 feet, turn the drill bit horizontally. I can explain that if anyone's interested later. And then drill horizontally. But the problem is that geological strata are not strictly horizontal, and if you just drill blindly and horizontally, you will quickly leave your productive zone and run into an unproductive zone, and therefore have a failure. So what you want to do is you really want to follow the productive zone, and geosteering allows you to do that by making measurements at the drill bit that tell you where you are. And here, the assignment for this contractor was to stay between the magenta and cyan bands, sort of at the interface. And they did that extremely well, within a few feet, which is remarkable, but typical these days. And you can even see there's a fault there at about 11,000 feet, where the layers are displaced by about 20 feet, typical geological situation. And after a while, the well bore recovered and went back to the interface between cyan and magenta. So this is the sort of thing you can do if you have instrumentation at the bit. And this is a fairly new practice, but let me give you some history of it. So the idea of having sophisticated measurements on the drill string at the drill bit is really something that came up during the energy crisis of the 1970s, when people were really trying to think very creatively about new ideas. One thing they came up with was this idea of measurements at the drill bit, which we call logging while drilling. Not logging like cutting down trees, but like data logging. Okay. Schlumberger, that was initiated by Sperry's son. Schlumberger took us a few years to sort of kind of wrap our heads around that idea, but in the early 80s we were working on it still, when there was a lot of money in research and development. Now, in 1986, the bottom fell out, and oil prices went way down, research and development budgets were cut severely. Those were not happy times. Nonetheless, shortly afterwards, some bright Schlumberger guy had the idea of doing this geosteering, using these instruments to actually actively control the trajectory of the drill bit. That was continued, the engineering of that was continued in the middle of the down cycle until the process was commercialized in the 90s, also in the middle of the down cycle. So the story here is that the sort of bright idea came when there was a lot of people thinking about bright ideas during the upcycle, when the price of oil was going up, but then really engineered in the middle of the down cycle. And here I've taken the oil price on the vertical axis as a surrogate for sort of industry innovation, for the drive for industry innovation. As you'll see, that's going to be a pattern here. So now let's talk about shale gas and tight oil. And this really is the big hydraulic fracturing story that we're all very familiar with and we've heard so much about. Again, the Schlumberger frac spread in Pennsylvania. So again, the horizontal axis is time from 1976 to the present. The vertical axis this time is not oil price, but it's gas price. And again, I'm going to take rising and high gas prices as a signal that we need to have some innovation in the system, and falling and low gas prices as a time of, discouragement in the industry. But let's just see what happened. So back in the 70s, it was realized after many decades of sort of policy uncertainty that natural gas was going to be an important source of energy in the age of oil embargoes. So the Department of Energy started this Eastern Gas Shales project, and most of us in the industry, I have to be honest with you, we're very skeptical about this Eastern Gas Shales because we all knew gas really would not come out of shale. Shale was something you drilled straight through to get to your productive horizon. We were familiar with them. The permeability to gas flow was just too low to be practical. But the DOE had this idea and did some really remarkable work. First of all, defining what the resource was, and then actually doing a lot of work on things like horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, and laid down a lot of the scientific basis for what would come later. Now, some people in the industry say that, well, it was really George Mitchell that pioneered this field, and George Mitchell was an amazing figure to whom all credit is due, but George Mitchell was sitting on the boards of some of these projects that were developing this new technology in the 70s and 80s. So George Mitchell knew exactly what was going on. And I think one of the Deloitte reports, in fact, talk about sort of government involvement in tracking patents and so on, which is a very interesting report. Anyway, the government, as gas prices went back down, government sort of lost interest. The Eastern Gas Shales projects the main activity was over by 86. It was sort of tapered down and totally gone by 96. But the lessons had been learned and taken into the private sector where they could really be implemented. So what we saw was the Mitchell organization and a few others working very hard to develop the technology of fracturing in shale, but in vertical wells. In the meantime, other people were drilling horizontal wells, first through Austin Chalk and then other tight gas sands and into shale eventually. But these were really developments working on two different tracks that didn't really come together until the early 2000s when this idea of multiple fractures in a horizontal well was developed. But all that engineering was done during a tremendous down cycle in the gas market when gas prices were low and not much new money was flowing into R&D. But nonetheless, the true believers carried on. And finally, of course, it came to fruition in the last decade in an amazing way. Now, let's talk about a industry-changing innovation that is now in progress. And that is maximizing recovery from tight oil. Now, the chart I'm showing here is all the ways that we extract oil from the ground from conventional reservoirs. So these technologies have been developed over the last 150 years of drilling wells into conventional reservoirs, and we have an abundant toolbox of techniques. And I'm not going to go through every box, obviously, but basically it falls into categories: primary recovery, secondary recovery, tertiary recovery. The primary recovery is just using the natural pressure of the earth to push oil out. Secondary recovery is that basically pressure maintenance and water flood, where we use water or natural gas to sort of keep the reservoir pressure up, and that encourages the oil to flow to the well. And then tertiary recovery, more used for heavy oil resources and so on. That's sort of much less common. But these days, almost every well in the world that's drilled goes on to secondary recovery right away. Okay, this is the conventional oil picture. This is the tight oil picture. Primary recovery, like gushers and nothing else. Because of the nature of these tight oil reservoirs, they're not buoyancy driven, which technicality, but what that means is that those water floods and pressure maintenance don't work. And we haven't developed the tertiary methods yet. So there's a lot of white space here to be filled up, and we need to fill it up because on primary recovery alone, we only get 5 to 10% of the oil out of the ground. The other 90 to 95% of the original oil in place is left in the ground, and that is really unacceptable. That's squandering a resource. So, what are the ways forward? One sort of obvious thing to do and sort of evolutionary thing to do is improve reservoir contact. You need to make sure that if you've got a rock which is reluctant to let oil or gas out, you need to maximize the contact between the rock and the well, and that's done with hydraulic fracturing and more infill drilling, which means drilling a well between two present wells, and then refracture is another sort of discussed and somewhat explored method. But really the big horizon is to skip right to tertiary recovery, where we can repressurize our reservoirs and get them productive again after we finish with a primary. And there's sort of two approaches that people are thinking about now. One is gas repressure, the other with carbon dioxide. So these are really, these are the horizons. But I'd like to say that these methods are going to be developed in the down cycle, which is where we are now. Work on this is continuing. Just a couple of weeks ago, EOG, a mid-sized independent, came out with news that they've been repressurizing reservoirs, tight oil reservoirs in the Eagle Ford with natural gas. So this work continues even after the price of oil has fallen off a cliff. So just to sum up, sort of the relationship between innovation and the business cycle, which is not at all obvious. But when oil and gas prices are rising or high, industry, R&D grows, research prioritizes novel techniques, new people enter the field, and these new people, these young people, are eager to generate new ideas. They want their own ideas, as I have done over the years. And you find academic and research is driven by perceived societal goals. And in the 70s, during the oil crisis, that was very much driven by petroleum and synthetic fuels. In the 80s, unconventional gas, coal bed methane, tight gas sands, and so on were the big story. In the 2010s, this decade, it's really renewables, and academic and government research has turned away from oil and gas, but that's okay, we can take care of ourselves. But that's the reality of it. Now, when oil prices are falling or low, academic and government research winds down, industry R&D shrinks, hiring is cut, there's less emphasis on novel techniques, more emphasis on efficiency improvements, which are prioritized, and inevitably some innovations are lost, and we don't know really what we've lost, but that's no doubt happened. Another thing that we see in the down part of the cycle is that technology development tends to get outsourced, and that's what I call downsizing of technology development risk. So back in the 80s, the big trend was for the international oil companies, which were up to that time the main developers of new industry-changing technology. They sort of outsourced that to the service companies, the Halliburtons, Schlumbergers, and Baker. In this downturn, what we're seeing is that the service companies, which are now the primary curators of technology innovation, are looking more to startups. Now, that's not to say we are closing down our research lab. I still have a job. But nonetheless, our M&A group has grown, and we are now looking more and more at those small companies to provide us with things that in the past probably we would have developed in-house organically. The final point I'd like to make, and I think this applies to sort of the broad range of industries, is that the industry leaders of the next upcycle are the ones that shrink the least in this down cycle. In the oil and gas sector, industry-changing innovations develop over 10 or 20 years, as I've shown in these two examples, and I have more examples to substantiate that. Nonetheless, the technology true believers will carry on through thick and thin. And that's a good thing, because otherwise we wouldn't have much large-scale innovation at all. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and now we'll take questions.
Thank you, Bob. That was a fascinating insight into innovation cycles. And I hope we can explore some of these things a little bit more in Q&A. So I'll open it to the floor, but I'll kick off with one question that fascinates me. Over these cycles, is there an optimum role for the different sources of innovation, whether it's government research, academics, service companies and operators, and does that change over the cycle? Is there an optimum place for each source of innovation?
Yes, that's a good question, and there certainly is. Sort of early in innovation cycles, it's basically private enterprise is reluctant to get into high-risk research, and that's really where the government and the academic world plays a role. I mean, right now we're sort of playing with something called methane hydrate, which is a huge source of natural gas, but it seems very crazy in several respects. And but our friends at the Department of Energy have a program exploring methane hydrate, and it will not come to fruition for 20 years. We don't need any more natural gas now. But nonetheless, 20 years from now, we'll be glad they did it. So where you have this pre-competitive and very long-reaching research, I think that's where government plays a role, and the same with the academic world. As you get closer to commercialization, then we don't want the government competing with us. We want to do it ourselves. We want to be able to secure that intellectual property. So that's the normal cycle, yeah.
Okay. Do we have any questions from the floor yet? Yes, here from John England in the front.
First of all, thanks for your comments. Really, really good stuff. One question I have is, so we've seen gas production costs go down dramatically. I mean, they've been in a low price environment for a long time, and I think reacted accordingly. And you know, we've started to see oil costs go down, but not maybe at that same rate. What's your thought about? I mean, can that follow the same path? Could we see, you know, costs, production costs around oil go down to as much on a kind of a percentage basis as we've seen happen with gas, and how, you know, maybe what are some of the innovations that might need to happen to see that happen?
Yeah, that's actually a much more profound question than you think it is. So the question is, can the cost of producing oil go down as fast as the cost of producing gas has? The answer is absolutely yes. And in fact, it kind of already is happening. I mean, right now we can produce gas in mid-Pennsylvania for less than $1 an MCF, which is crazy cheap. It is astounding. So after we crashed the gas market by being so efficient and having such great technology, then we moved on and crashed the oil market, and the same thing happened. Now, several things happened. So I talked about sort of the natural progression of how things get cheaper as you become more familiar with the geology in your area and your supply chains are optimized. But another thing that's happening is that, and this I think is not fully recognized in the industry, is that people talk about break-even cost. And a lot of energy analysis groups, companies, and so on, published break-even costs, which the Saudis were studying very intently, my friends in Riyadh have told me, in terms of, well, what this tight oil stuff, you know, how much can we lower the market before we really drive them out of the market? But it turns out that there's a break-even cost for greenfield production, which is going into a new field, Mississippi lime, and having to learn everything from scratch and set up your supply chain from scratch. There's a half-cycle cost, which is the cost of basically drilling wells to maintain level production. And then there's lifting cost, which is you've got your well, how much does it cost to get it out of the ground? Lifting costs are very low, even for US tight oil, sort of $10 to $15 range. So we can produce oil very cheaply once the fields are established, once the wells are drilled. Now, you have to keep drilling wells to maintain level production, but that's a big part of the story, that these numbers the Saudis were relying on changed underneath their feet. As the price of oil went down, we stopped doing greenfield exploration, and then we stopped drilling wells to maintain production. And the industry has been, you know, production has remained high.
I'm looking one question at the back there.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I thought it was really insightful. I work for an integrated electric utility, and there's many folks in our company that feel that we just completely missed the signals around shale and the technology innovations, and it's been pretty significant in terms of our earnings. So one of the questions I have for you is, if we were to look back on it 10, 20 years, what should companies like mine have been looking at in terms of signals, and then going forward as new technologies are being contemplated? Are there things that we ought to be paying attention to that we're just not?
Well, you're forcing me to make a very embarrassing admission. Very embarrassing. In 2006, 2007, I was on the National Petroleum Council report that was titled Hard Choices, I forget the exact title, but, you know, dealing with the new energy environment of low resources. This was in 2006. I already knew about shale gas. We considered it a niche play in Oklahoma. And in that National Petroleum Council report to the Secretary of Energy, where there was probably 100 pages about gas resource, shale got a half a page or a page. So really, nobody saw it coming, not even the insiders. I think probably not even the people in Texas and Oklahoma realized it was going to be as revolutionary as it turned out to be. So in that case, there was really nothing you could have done. You could have read our expert reports and still not gotten it. So it's an embarrassing admission, but sometimes technology takes us by surprise, and sometimes it comes out of left field. And it did in this case.
Good. More questions from the floor? Down here, John McHugh.
Thanks, Bob. Is there an area that you see on the horizon in E&P or production operations that is ripe for some sort of technology to revolutionize it, whether that's rig operations or the use of some types of surfactant agents to increase production? Kind of like what's out there that might extend things even further?
Well, the number one issue that's out there is the one that I highlighted in my talk, which is this production enhancement in these tight plays. I mean, we have so much upside potential there. And we have some thoughts of how to do it. My colleagues back at the lab are working on it, but that's something that we've got a long way to go on. One thing you hear about is sort of big data, and that's kind of like a buzzword these days. And there's many ways of using data. I think you need to look at each application individually to understand its potential. Probably most of those are very evolutionary. It's like better computer-aided design. I think that's one application I saw, or just using the data we're collecting better, or more instruments. Those are things that are going to give you slow increases. For the big ones, it's like Administrator Szyminski said, it's very hard to predict things that are unpredictable. And I can tell you that we in research are doing our best to surprise you.
I'd like to put you on the spot, Bob, to wrap up. And we had not prepared this question, but given that unconventional tight oil recovery is 5 to 10%, as you pointed out, and conventional oil recovery is 40 to 50% when you apply those techniques, what should tight oil be aiming at? What should we expect in terms of recovery factor improvements, do you think, over the next 20 years?
Next 20 years. How about next 10 years?
Or 10 years.
This is going to be just a crazy guess anyway. I mean, I think if we brought that up to 20 or 30%, I think everyone would be extremely delighted. If you use CO2, sort of huff and puff, that's going to work a few times. It's not going to work forever. So if we could bring that up even to the 20 or 30% range, I think people would consider job well done.
So that would be in the context of doubling or tripling of the unconventional oil potential of the US and other plays around the world. So really positive horizons if we keep working on it. Thank you, Bob. We appreciate the comments, and please join me in giving a big hand.